It's my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon for our ISG seminar hosted by ANU Indonesia project. As we commence, I want to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, from whose traditional lands the ANU campus rests, and pay our respect to the elders past and present. So as the usual format, we will have a presentation from our speaker for 45 minutes, and then this will be followed by a 45-minute Q&A session. So I would like to introduce our speaker. It's such an honor for me to introduce Dr. Nathaniel Sumartoyo. So Dr. Nathaniel is an assistant professor of political science at the National University of Singapore, not Australian National University, it's just National University of Singapore. And he studies the causes and outcomes of social and political inclusions and exclusions, with a focus on those influenced by ethno-religious sentiments. And he addresses these kind of questions at the individual and also at the institutional level. So including how the government implement the discriminatory policies. And for this afternoon, he will be presenting his research on this one, the broader political significance of houses of worship, theory and evidence from Indonesian mosque. And I would like to remind those who are joining us online, later for the Q&A session, you could type your questions in the chat box, and we will read out your questions aloud. And also, please, this seminar will be is recorded, right? Yeah, this seminar is recorded for future viewing, so please be aware of that one too. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nathaniel Sumartoyo.
Thank you. So I'll just click on here. Thank you everyone for coming here and for this opportunity. I was actually here at ANU 4 years ago in July 2019 when I was a visiting fellow with the Indonesian project. So it's really good to come back here. And this project that I'm going to present is an ongoing project. I just started doing this project like basically 1 year ago. So it's not exactly on a first stage, but it still will benefit from feedback, and especially because of the result that I'm going to present you might prove a little bit might impact discussions among some groups of people. So I'll start with
nggak bisa ya?
Mesti dipencet. Yeah. Fine, good. So I'll start with these two news articles that were published about 5 years ago in 2018 on the Jakarta Post. These news articles talk about studies, one conducted by the State Intelligence Agency or BIN, and one conducted by Coalition of Civil Society Organizations. So these studies, they were interested in examining what sermons were actually delivered in mosques in Jakarta. So they sent their researchers to go to these mosques and record and analyze sermons on Friday prayers in some mosques in Jakarta that they were attracted, about 100 mosques in each of the studies. And they found that conservative leaning, if not radical sermons, were not uncommon in these mosques. And of particular concern was these mosques were actually mosques in government office complexes. So they were attended by government workers. There was quite a brouhaha after this research was published, as expected. But I'm not interested in the brouhaha. I'm interested in using this article as a means to underline how concerns about what's happening in houses of worship is not exactly new. And it's not only about this phenomenon in Indonesia. In other countries, we find a similar phenomenon where civil societies or governments, you can think of it as somewhat concerned about what's happening in houses of worship, not only mosques but churches. In Bangladesh, the government launched what they call model mosque, that is basically mosque that toe the line of government agenda in order to counter radicals. And in Egypt and in Turkey, the government puts a strong monitoring on sermons in mosque. They have basically an agenda that on this Friday you have to preach this thing, which the preachers in the countries basically have to follow. But it's not only a phenomenon limited to Muslim countries. In the US, there is a similar concern. There are observers and social scientists who argue and highlight the importance of evangelical churches, including sermons in evangelical churches, in motivating the January 6th Capitol attack. And on the bottom right there is a picture of a protest by the Westboro Baptist Church, which is I would say it's a typical church. It's an atypical church, and actually labeled by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. All of these examples show that houses of worship have invited concerns and have invited interest by the government and also civil society organizations, because they might actually promote or at least be a channel of anti-democratic attitudes. So that's the motivation of this research. That is understanding how houses of worship actually shape the political landscape. But notwithstanding this importance, notwithstanding the attention that houses of worship have attracted from policymakers and from civil society activists alike, when we look at research on the topic, on what social scientists have done to understand the importance of houses of worship, what we find is that existing research has looked primarily on the effects of houses of worship on their congregations or on their attendees. So, for example, some social scientists examine the influence of mosques on people who go to that mosque, or the influence of churches, the influence of sermons in a church to people who go to that church. That's fine. That's certainly an important political research. That's an important study. But this kind of focus, what I call specific political significance, actually overlooks two important features of houses of worship. That is, houses of worship are generally neighborhood institutions. So they are important not only to people who go to those houses of worship, but also they are important to the neighborhood as a whole. They have activities that are open to the community. They have makan bareng, like communal eating here, on picture on the left, top left, or in churches in the US, especially in the rural areas, you also find community barbecue hosted by churches. So churches create communities, churches invite communities outside of their congregations. They are neighborhood institutions. The second feature of houses of worship that existing research tends to overlook by focusing only on the congregations is that houses of worship are everywhere. And this is a Google screenshot of my house in Jakarta. My house is somewhere over there. And every little dot red is a mosque or a musola. This screenshot captures an area of 2.5 square kilometers, but you can count that there are 30 mosques and musolas in that area of 2.5 square kilometers. So houses of worship are everywhere, and the same if you do it with taking a screenshot of the southern US, you will find many evangelical churches as well. So given these two features of houses of worship as neighborhood institutions and the fact that they're everywhere, it's not enough to look at only how they affect the congregations. So my question is, how do houses of worship affect the community's social and political attitudes as a whole? So I'm not interested only in the congregations. In fact, I'm more interested in understanding the effects of houses of worship on the neighborhood and on the community as a whole. In other words, I'm interested in community influence. And I'm going to define community influence here as influence of a majority group's house of worship on the group members' attitudes and behaviors. So for example, because I'm studying Indonesia at the moment in this paper, I'm interested in the effects of mosques, that is the majority Muslims' houses of worship, on Muslims' social and political attitudes. If I'm going to do the same project in the Philippines, or for example, in the Philippines, I would be interested in the effects of churches, Catholic churches, on the Catholic majority social and political attitudes. If I do it in the southern US, I would be interested in examining, for example, evangelical churches on evangelicals' social and political attitudes. So that's my interest here. And in this project, it would be the effects of mosques in Indonesia on the social and political attitudes of Muslim respondents. And basically, if you have any clarification questions, feel free to interrupt me. If I think that the answer will take, if I think that the question will take a long answer, I will just table it and come back to it later. But if I think that I can answer the clarification question rather shortly, I would be answering on the spot. So feel free to interrupt. Now we talk about data, like how will I answer the questions about how houses of worships or mosques in Indonesia shape Muslims' political attitudes. So I'm bringing to this paper 3 data sets. The first data set is data of mosques that I scraped from the mosque information system managed by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. So the mosque information system, or in Indonesian, is called SIMAS, Sistem Informasi Masjid. As of December 31st, 2022, that's the last time I ran my paper, it has data about 300,000 mosques across Indonesia. The way the system works is that takmir, or mosque administrators, they have to register their mosque to the system, to the website, or to the database. And in exchange, if their mosque is registered in the database, then they are eligible to receive government assistance. They can apply for some grants, and then if they win the grant, they will get the money. So that's how the system works. And the second data set that I'm bringing to the table that I analyzed in the paper is, I'm sure people at ANU is quite familiar with it, is the Indonesian Family Life Survey. Specifically, I'm focusing on rounds 4, filled in 2007, and round 5, filled in 2014. It's a panel study interviewing the same respondents over time and also their new household members. The round 4 has records of 44,000 individuals in 13,000 households. The round 5 data has records of 50,000 individuals in 16,000 households. And lastly, the third data set that I'm incorporating into the analysis is 2010 national census. And I use the national census data to calculate kecamatan characteristics that I will use to examine the potential mechanisms for the most influence. Just some descriptive statistics or descriptive information about the data first. So this is from the CMAS data. The CMAS data has pieces of information about each mosque. For example, the name of the mosque, the location in terms of kecamatan, kelurahan, and also when it was built, and also, for example, the status of the land that it was built, whether it's ownership or wakaf land, for example. And here I simply plot the number of mosques in each year from 1990 to 2020. In 1990, there's about 150,000 mosques across Indonesia in the dataset, in the CMAS database. And in 2022, there's about 270,000 mosques in the CMAS dataset. That's actually an increase of 80% from 1990 to 2022. What's a good comparison to that? A good comparison is an increase in the population itself. So between 1990 and 2022, the number of mosques grew by 80%, while the Indonesian population itself grew by 50% only. So the number of mosques outpaces the growth in population. We can discuss later what that means. And this is another descriptive information about the data is the number of mosques per 1,000 Muslim residents by kabupaten. The southern coast of Java usually has a higher mosque density per 1,000 Muslim respondents. Sorry, 1,000 Muslim residents according to the 2010 census, but also parts of South Sulawesi there, pretty dark, and also part of North Sumatra also has a high mosque density. Sorong there, it also has a high mosque density per 1,000 Muslim respondents. Sorry, 1,000 Muslim residents. We are talking about the 2010 census here. So that's some descriptive information about locations of mosques and the number of mosques across the years. I should have some more descriptive pictures, but we can see it later during the Q&A if anyone is interested. So what's the method? So I'm focusing, the analysis is individual level analysis, that is the IFLS respondents, but I'm focusing on kecamatan as the geographic unit of interest. It's a third level administrative subdivision. After province, there is municipality and regency, and within municipalities and regencies are kecamatan. The inclusion criteria for the respondents is that the respondents have to be Muslims, because again, that's part of the project, examining the effects of the majority religion's house of worship on the majority religion's social and political activities. And the respondents have to be Muslim, and they have to live in the same kecamatan between 2007 and 2014. That is, they are not moving out or moving in. The justification is that in order for the effects of mosques in these kecamatans to be felt by the respondents, that the respondents cannot go out of the kecamatans, and they cannot also just recently move into the kecamatans. So they have to stay and they have to live in the same kecamatans in this period. And my estimation is using a difference in difference. I'm interested in the coefficient B3, that is how the difference between the treatment or the control is different in 2007 compared to the difference in 2014. A kecamatan is considered as a treated kecamatan if it has a new mosque, at least one new mosque built between 2007 and 2013. And out of the 1,081 kecamatans that I could match between these data sets, 182 or about 70% had no new mosques reported in the CMAS. And these 182 kecamatans accounted for about 20% of the respondents. So these are the control kecamatans. Again, the treatment is whether or not the kecamatan has at least one new mosque. If the kecamatan did not have at least one new mosque between 2007 and 2013, the kecamatan would be treated as a control, and respondents in the kecamatan would be the control respondents. I don't want to make an assumption about familiarity with the method, so I will just to be fully transparent. Basically, what I'm estimating with the DID, difference in difference, is that we assume that the control kecamatan, that is kecamatan that have no new mosque, it has a certain trajectory. Let's say, this trajectory is the trajectory of the control kecamatan. And we assume that the trajectory of the treatment kecamatan would follow the trajectory of the control kecamatan had they not had new mosques. But let's say that the new mosque shift the trajectory this way, then the effects of the effect of new mosque would be the difference between what actually happened with what could have happened in this kecamatan. So that's basically the basic intuition of difference. Now talking about the outcome variables, or what dependent variables I am trying to estimate or trying to predict here. The IFLS waves 4 and 5 have variables that capture into what I call three topics or three categories of outcome variables. The first is outgroup rejection. That is whether or not the Muslim respondents object to non-Muslims living in the village, living in the neighborhood, living in the same household, living in the same house, or whether or not the Muslim respondents objected to non-Muslim worship house in the village, and also objected to interfaith marriage. And the second type of outcome variables is political preferences. That is whether or not the Muslim respondents listed religious similarity as a criterion when deciding whom to vote in the election, and whether or not they listed ethnically similar candidate as a criterion for voting for someone in the election. And the third type or the category of outcome variables is what I call in-group attachment or good neighborliness. That is whether or not the extent to which the Muslim respondents trust fellow Muslims, and also the extent to which they trust co-ethnic people, and the extent to which they are willing to help neighbors who are in need. The variables with asterisks were actually on a 4-point scale, but for the sake of facilitating the interpretation of effect sizes, I simply dichotomize the variables, and it doesn't matter whether or not the variables are dichotomized. You can see it like that. So what's the results here? On the y-axis is the 10 dependent variables divided by the categories: outgroup rejection here, and then political preferences here, and in-group attachment the last 3. The x-axis is the magnitude of the effects. That is the effects of new mosque on the corresponding dependent variable. We can see that when it comes to outgroup rejection, new mosques have positive and statistically significant effects. That is, kecamatans that have new mosques between 2007 and 2013 tend to be more respondents in the kecamatan that have new mosques between 2007 and 2013 tend to exhibit higher exclusionary attitudes toward non-Muslims compared to respondents in the control kecamatan. And the effects of the other variables are not statistically significant. Preference for Muslim candidate is also significant, but it's not actually robust. You will see it better. And so let's try to make sense of the effect sizes. Basically, new mosque living in a kecamatan with at least one new mosque corresponds to about 6 percentage point increase to 7 percentage point increase in the exclusionary attitudes among the respondents. And so the takeaway from this model, is that new mosques correspond to increased outgroup rejection toward the Muslims and no effect on other outcomes.
Sorry, clarification on what the data. So you're saying increase, meaning you're comparing it from the responses of the people from the same kecamatan before and after the mosque, or you're comparing kecamatan with no mosque and one mosque?
It's It's the same because it's panel data, so it's the same people
Okay.
before.
Before and after, you're not comparing no mosque to one mosque, right?
Well, you're comparing the difference.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. You're comparing the difference.
Actually, both.
so you're both, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Difference in difference.
So there was a control group and a baseline measurement and another
that's
measurement.
another measurement. So
Yeah.
this is the difference in the increase in the two groups. right?
Yeah, yeah, the difference in the
Okay.
difference. Yeah.
Got it. So,
So, hands.
Alright.
Alright. Alright, so that's the main model. That's the main result. Oh, the first question that anyone is gonna ask, peer reviewers gonna ask is like, are these results robust to modeling specification type? So I ran 6 robustness checks. Recall that I dichotomized the variables earlier. So the first robustness check is binary DV with covariates. So adding covariates, we can show it later what the covariates are. The covariates are individual level and also kecamatan level. And the second robustness check is I'm using the original scale, the 4-point scale, and then original scale with covariates. And then in the fourth robustness check, I analyze only kecamatans with more than 10 respondents. Because the majority of these kecamatans only actually have 1 respondents. Oh, not 1, between 1 and 10. So someone might say, well, can you make an inference about the kecamatan just because of 9 people? So I'm here with the fourth robustness check, analyzing only kecamatans with more than 10 respondents. And then in the fifth robustness check, I'm including only as treated kecamatans with 1 exactly new mosque. So you're comparing the control kecamatan, that is the ones with 0 new mosque, with restrictive kecamatan that has exactly 1 new mosque. So because some of the kecamatans have like 50 new mosques or something like that. And you can think that maybe the kecamatans are the ones who are that are driving the effects. With this fifth robustness check, I'm showing that no, that's not the case. And the sixth robustness check is using propensity formatting on covariates and pretreatment DVs, because again, in the spirit of transparency, one critical assumption of difference is that the 2 categories of kecamatans have to have parallel trends, right? But because there are only 2 waves, it's impossible to assert that to confirm that parallel trends. So one way to do it is you match the kecamatans on covariates and pretreatment dependent variables first, just to increase their similarities. And these are the results of the robustness checks. These are actually regression coefficients. If they are grayed out, it means that they are not statistically significant. If they are bold and have blue colors, it means that they are positively related and significantly statistically significant. And you can see that the first column here is the main models, and the alternative specifications are just pretty much replicating the main models. And this suggests that the results are not dependent on modeling specifications. Whether or not you include covariates, whether or not you use binary dependent variables, or the 4-point scales, or whether or not you match the kecamatans based on pretreatment covariates, and whether or not you employ strict definition of kecamatan or strict definition of treatments, you get the same results. That is, new mosques correspond to higher exclusionary attitudes, but not the other dependent variables. The second question, other than modeling specifications, that one might ask is it indeed the treatment or the new mosques that drive the results? And one way to rule this, one way to answer this question is by showing that if there is no new mosque, there is no effect. So that's what I'm doing here with the 3 placebo tests. The first placebo test is that I focus only on control kecamatan, that is kecamatan that have no new mosque, and then I randomly assign half of these control kecamatans to have fictitious hypothetical new mosque. Recall that this couple of kecamatan don't have new mosques, but I'm just assigning them to have fake new mosques. So these mosques are not real and they should not have any effects. And the second placebo is what's called in-time placebo. So I define the treatment period to be between 2000 and 2006. That's before wave 4. Kecamatans with a new mosque, with a new mosque between 2000 and 2006 will be treated as a treated kecamatan, and kecamatan that didn't have new mosque between this period were treated as control kecamatans. Because of this time period was before the first wave of the survey, IFLS wave 4, then whether or not kecamatans have new mosques between this period should not affect the results between 2007 and 2014. And the third placebo test is analysis of movers. Recall again that I exclude respondents who moved in or out of the kecamatan. Now in this analysis, I analyze only people who moved out of the kecamatan or into the analyzed kecamatan. These people did not experience the effects of mosque in the kecamatan. So all of these three placebo tests, it should result in no effects. And that's what you get basically. The first column is again the main models. And these are the placebo tests. All of the coefficients are practically not statistically significant, except with this one group there. So placebo models are largely no effects. When the treatment is absent, when there is no new mosque, there is also no effect. Right. So hopefully that has established the robustness of the findings and also allied concerns about whether it is indeed the new mosque that drive the results. The second part of this project is examining what's actually responsible for these effects, right? Because houses of worship are a lot of things. It can be the preachers, it can be the sermons, it can be the activities that they host in the house of worship, it can be the banners that they put out of the places. It can be a lot of things. So what's the mechanism? I hypothesized that there are actually three possible mechanisms. The first is what I call confessional mechanism. That is, houses of worship promote and cultivate piety in the community. Like Muslims who hear azan from mosque might feel that they have to pray. And also invitations to Friday prayers that come from mosque might also motivate people to join the mosque. Not to say and not to forget that mosque activities are also important channel for persuasion, right? So the first mechanism says that houses of worship have these effects, mosques have these effects because they make the community more religious. The second mechanism is about social and psychological mechanisms. We know that houses of worship are not just a place to pray, they're also a place for community to gather. And whenever people gather, there is a social network there. So the second mechanism says that mosques lead to these effects we saw earlier because they promote religious identity and they promote networks between Muslims. The more mosques there are in the community, the stronger the Muslims in the community might feel toward the Ummah or toward fellow Muslims. And the denser the social networks between Muslims in the community might be. And the third mechanism is what I call informational mechanism. Mosques are important because they provide information on both secular and sacred matters. The sacred matters part is perhaps uncontroversial, but also mosques are important because they provide information about secular matters as well. During COVID, when you were in Indonesia during COVID, you will hear mosques blasting announcements about don't forget to take your vaccine or maintain safe distance, or even in my neighborhood, mosques announce who passed away last night. There's no announcement about why, but they informed the community that someone has passed away the day before. So this is information that coming up out of mosques, and in some places, and it's also uncommon. It's not uncommon in Indonesia that mosques also provide healthcare services, posyandu, or weighing infants where doctors check health of infants. So mosque is also important to provide information to the community. So let's check the first mechanism first. That is whether it is indeed religiosity that drives the results. If religiosity is indeed responsible for the effects, we should at least observe two implications. The first is that mosques should also lead to higher salat frequency. That is, if mosques make people more religious, then they should at least motivate people to follow or at least to practice the mandatory daily salat. And also, if mosques indeed promote the results because they increase religiosity, we should get the same results when we replace mosques with musolas, right? Because musolas, just like mosques, they are a place to pray. So if it's in the prayer that matters, then the effects of mosques should be the same as the effects of musolas. What we find is that there's no support for both predictions. Here on the left, this is the percentage of respondents who reported practicing the mandatory 5 daily salat. The difference between the new mosque here and the non-new mosque, between the treated and the control kecamatan here in 2007 is not statistically different from the difference between these two groups here in 2014. So the presence of new mosques do not make people in the community, do not make Muslim in the community to be more likely to practice the daily salat. And here, this is the effects of new musolas on the dependent variables. None of these effects are statistically significant. If you recall, the effects of mosques are positive and statistically significant on exclusionary attitudes. But here, all of these effects are not statistically significant, which suggests that just prayer is not enough. So it's not because mosques and houses of worship make people more religious that they exhibit higher exclusionary attitudes. It's something else. It has to be something else. And so I test the second mechanism, that is networks and identity. And I test it rather indirectly. That is, if it's indeed because of group identity and social networks, then certain identity-related variables should amplify or weaken the effects of mosques. And here I'm examining the effects of 5 potential moderators. On individual level, Friday interview, that's where people pray. If it's indeed about group identity, then the effect should be stronger on Fridays. And actually, there's an article that shows that in the Muslim world, that's actually the case. In the MENA region, that's actually the case. And then the second moderator is identification with the Muslim organization and or Muhammadiyah, because identifying with the Muslim organization arguably would embed you in organizations with strong networks. Then you would have dense religious networks if you are part of these organizations, and that should affect the effects of mosques if social psychological mechanism is indeed what matters. And then on kecamatan levels, higher shares of Muslims, I believe would affect social networks as well, and higher share of wakaf mosques. Wakaf is when people donate their land to be built where people donate their lands so that mosque can be built on them. The higher share of wakaf mosque in a kecamatan, I believe, indicates stronger attachment within the community and the mosque, because people will not just give away their lands if they don't feel attached to the mosque. And higher share of NU Muhammadiyah in the kecamatan as well. And this is the result that I got. None of the interaction effects are statistically significant, which means that the socio-psychological variables that I just described do not amplify or weaken the effects of mosques. Lastly, testing information provision as mechanism. The strategy is the same. That is, I examine if certain information related variables amplify or weaken the effects of mosques. And here I'm focusing on 4 moderators. The first is education, individual level education. The higher the level of education, the more people are able to process information and the more likely they have to divert, the more likely they have to have different information sources. And cognitive ability, the same. Higher cognitive ability also supposedly enables people to more critically process information. And then the third one is alternative information sources. That is, the FLS has questions that tap into whether the respondents were able to read newspapers, whether in Bahasa or in local language, whether they have TVs, whether they have access to the internet or social media from their phones. All of these are alternative information sources. The argument being, if mosques indeed matter because they provide information, then their significance, their influence should be weaker among people who have other sources for information. And kecamatan level, median level of education in the kecamatan. So these moderators basically capture 2 things. That is, the ability to critically evaluate information or access to alternative information sources. And this is the results that I get. These coefficients are red, which means that they are statistically significant and negative. That is, they weaken the effects of mosques. Because this is again interactive effects between these variables and the treatment effect. Education, the higher the level of education, the weaker the effects of mosques on exclusionary attitudes when it comes to objection to living in the same village, the same neighborhood, and also objection to worship house. And the same with cognitive ability. So the IFRS has a question in wave 5 that taps into verbal and mathematics reasoning. So that's I use that as a measure of cognitive ability. Cognitive ability also weakens the effects of mosques. The effects of mosques on exclusionary attitudes are weaker among people with higher cognitive ability. Information sources, the same. The more information sources that individuals have, the weaker the effects of mosques on them. And median level of education in kecamatan also has a weakening effects on the effects of mosques on exclusionary attitudes. So I interpret these coefficients as a strong support for the information mechanism. Effects of mosques on exclusionary attitudes are weaker among those who can either critically evaluate information, that is, has higher education or has cognitive ability, or those who have alternative sources of information. That is, alternative sources of information that they can use to compare the information they get from mosques. Just to summarize, new mosques correspond to increased exclusionary attitudes toward non-Muslims, and I would say that this result is not the first. This project is not the first to document these effects. All of these studies also show the same findings, even though they use a different approach. They use like ethnographic methods. And it seems that the effects are driven by loss of mosques and the communication and information channel in the communities. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this project is using data from Indonesia, but actually looking broadly. This is not about Indonesia. This is about houses of worship affect political behavior in religious societies. And to bring these Indonesian findings to the broader world, I argue that houses of worship will have broader political significance. That is, they will influence attitudes and behaviors in the community as long as the conditions are satisfied. The first is that houses of worship have to be central in the community's life. It is the community condition. And the second condition is communication condition. That is, they have to provide information to the community about things sacred and also secular. So they cannot just be a place to pray. And that's why I would be intrigued to do this project in India, where temples are less of a place to gather because there is no strong tradition of Friday prayer or Sunday mass in Hindu. It will be interesting to examine if these effects would hold in these conditions. And the third condition is openness condition. I think the effects of houses of worship on the community would manifest more strongly if the society is free, in the sense that there is no restriction or censorship placed or imposed by the government on houses of worship or on the society at large. And with that in mind, I thank you again for your attention and for attending this presentation. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure that you have lots of questions, as I have too. Oh my God. I'm seeing my cards. Oh, lots of questions. Okay. All right. I will use my privilege to ask the questions. So, Mas Nathaniel, it's wonderful you give this mosque agency. You talk about how the mosque, basically you use the term the mosque, not the takmir or not the preacher. So I thought it's good. Give the mosque agency. I was just wondering, when you mentioned about the mosque, who established this new mosque? And is it Da'wah organizations or Muslim organizations or local people in that area? Because you also mentions that the other thing, we know that some conservative groups like Salafi, for example, and other Islamist movements, they are very active in trying to establish this new mosque. And because one of the things that you mentioned is also this new mosque correspondent to increase out-group rejection toward non-Muslims. So I thought, oh yeah, probably this has something to do with this, I don't know, Islamist groups or conservative groups. They are trying to establish mosque, because we can see that one in many parts of Indonesia. In Makassar, one of my Silbrick area, for example, there are maybe this new housing complex, and then basically those who are in charge with that mosque, they are conservative groups like Salafi groups. They're very active there. And the other thing is, you mentioned about this objection to interfaith marriage. So I thought it's very interesting. My question is, why do you input that kind of question? Because that's a very sensitive issue, especially if you ask that question to people in the mosque, interfaith marriages. Because even in Indonesia, we know that the reception, the acceptance towards this interfaith marriage is also still very, very low. And the other thing you also mentioned about the mosque should lead a higher salat frequency. How did you, in terms of methodology, how did you do that thing? How did you come up with that result? Because I think you mentioned in your abstract, you analyzed 290,000 mosques. Am I right? I don't know how. Yeah, because I'm anthropologist. That's why I'm like, how did you come up with that kind of? Did you go there? Did you analyze these practices, the ritual practices? Did you ask them? So so those are my questions. Anyway, okay, let's open up now to the audience question.
But maybe he should answer those.
Sorry, Pak. Pak Nathaniel, silakan.
I guess I'm from here. The rest that there I will hide behind the screen. So who established this report? That's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer. My answer is just, I don't know. Because in the CMAS database, there's no information about who owns or who sponsored this mosque. So I cannot really have a good answer to that. But I can tell you though, that in a separate analysis, for a separate paper, I examine where new mosques are actually built. And we have two hypotheses for this. New mosques are built where there is demand for them. That is where there are more Muslims, higher proportion of Muslims. And the second is new mosques are built in areas where there is a religious competition from non-Muslims. That is in non-Muslim, in Muslim majority kecamatan's, in non-Muslim provinces. And my analysis actually shows it's the second hypothesis that's supported. That is the growth of new mosques is really concentrated in Muslim majority kecamatan's in non-Muslim provinces, where there is religious competition and where there is religious quote-unquote threat. So, but I think it will be, I agree it will be interesting to see who actually sponsored this new mosque, because they seem to have significant and undesirable effects on exclusionary attitudes. But I don't have answer to that. Why interfaith marriage? I think my strategy is just using whatever questions are relevant in the IFRS. I just ask the IFRS people, but interfaith marriage tends to be regarded as a good indicator of interfaith relations there. And why I bring more subtly to high solar frequency, and I certainly did not go to the mosque and interview people there. 290,000 mosques, like going to each one of them is gonna require a good work. So I guess the assumption would be that if there are more mosques in a neighborhood, you will hear more azans, and it's will be much more difficult to miss information about, hey, it's time to pray. So arguably, if there are more mosques in a neighborhood, then you will get more reminders that it's time to pray. You will be less likely to miss daily 5 daily salah. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Pak Nathaniel. More questions from Ed, and then Pak Callum, and then Busana. Oh yeah, and those joining online, please, we have this Q&A chat box there. Please type your questions there, and we will read your questions out aloud. Okay, Pak Ed.
Thank you. So I have 3 questions. The first 2 are just simple ones. First of all, you said that the database, CMAS, I think it was called, had 296,000 mosques, but then you referred to Musiola as well. So is the Musiola a subset of those 290? That's a separate.
Then there's 360,000.
Okay, so there's a totally separate data set. Okay, I missed that. The second one is about, and maybe you were sort of getting at it when you were talking about where the new mosques are appearing. Did you look at patterns of regional variation in these results, and were there any? That's the second question. And then the third one is one of interpretation. So you said that your paper isn't about Indonesia, but this is the Indonesia study group, and we are actually interested in Indonesia. So can you give us some interpretation of how, why this is a significant finding for the study of political Islam or Islam and society in Indonesia? Because at first sight, it seems to be just saying that if you have more mosques, then you have more religious intolerance, which doesn't seem to, it doesn't seem to take us very far, I guess. And particularly given your framing was about these radical preachers and the bin identification of these particular sources of radicalism, but you're saying mosques in general are bad for tolerance. So could you just expand a bit on what you think this tells us, or how it modifies what we already know about spiritual Islam?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Would you like to collect the questions or you want to respond one by one?
It's after wasn't usually culture here.
Oh, yeah. Should we just collect questions? Yeah, okay. Okay, silakan Pak Kalem and then Busana. And then after that, the next round, Nafa and Pak Firman.
Hi, thanks very much. I was just wondering on a practical level whether or not you've considered inequality or indicators about inequality in the areas that you had identified as having increased intolerance. I have more questions in the second or third or fourth round, so I'll flip over to this.
Okay, Busana?
Yeah, thanks. So this is really interesting. I had two questions about your methods and sort of assumptions, right? So one is, you kept saying the word treatment, and you're obviously using a DID in here, but in your explanation for where these mosques are coming from, they're not being randomly assigned to these kecamatan. People are volunteering in what you're describing as a treatment, right? And one of the really interesting reasons that you described is because there's already competition between minority and majority communities. So to what extent are mosques a symptom of that rather than being a cause of what you're describing, right? So that's one question that you will get from somebody who's like sort of looking at intolerance broadly and sort of thinking about, you know, everything that we know. And it's not just between, the competition is not just between members of majority and minority communities, but also between members of majority communities who are vying for dominance, you know, within a community. So mosques are a very powerful sort of, you have an NU mosque, or you have a Mohammedan mosque, or you have a Salafi mosque, or what kind of mosque? So to what extent is mosque just a symbol or a sign or a symptom of the bigger problem that is driving this train for you, right? So that's something to consider. The other is, you know, you started this presentation by talking about neighborhoods. As I was saying, you know, we want to talk about individuals, we want to talk about neighborhoods, but then your analysis is on kecamatan level. And so in that sense, sort of on a technical level, you're choosing sort of 10 people or more, right? Respondents from a kecamatan, and with an addition of one mosque. The average population of a kecamatan in Java is like millions, like how, 100,000. It's a lot of people, right? So what's sort of your sense of the probability of exposure to treatment for the person who's actually answering that question? I guess are the two questions sort of trying to understand the significance of the finding.
Good. Very good, you know.
Yes. For this round, yeah.
So I just go chronologically. Regional variation of the treatment. I'm going to keep saying treatment. Yeah, I'll get back to some point later. Because it's easier treatment. Not saying strong causality, but treatments are easier to say. In terms of treatment effects, there's no regional variation. So I tried Java and Java, I tried the big islands, urban rural, there's no, and including the share of Muslims also not significant moderator. And I also did whether the treatment effects are like conditioned by the 2014 election results. I'll be happy to show, but I think that raises more questions than answers. When it's on basis, I will show it. And in terms of question about interpretations, why significant findings? Like, I see it this way. I see it significant for two reasons. The first and the most important, I think, is that it hints to the fact that Indonesians take religious authorities and religious institutions seriously as a source of information. So, and I would not claim that that's a new claim, because the American politics scholars only find this in the 1940s because of the Chicago School Sociological Model. Sorry, the Columbia School Sociological Model. So religious institutions and religious authorities are important because they are more proximate to voters, to people than academics, than ordinary politicians, than experts who appear on TVs. So what it means is that we need to understand what these institutions and figures actually saying on the ground, and what they say, how they say affect people's opinions. And this result, I think, is a first step on that, because I'm saying that whatever is coming out of mosques is weaker among those who can evaluate this information critically. So it's important what actually is coming out of it. And the second significance is that, hey, if there are concerns about any potential undemocratic consequences of houses of worship in Indonesia or any other places, my study says that the solution is not censorship or monitoring. The solution is that you provide people with means to either be more critical of information, or second, you provide them with alternative sources of information. You dilute the importance of any particular source of information, which in this case is source of worship. And I think that's important, considering that in Indonesia there's a tendency to censor things right now, especially those like with the deployment of FPI, some voices are becoming more suppressed. So maybe like we talk about intolerance or FPI in general, like the solution is not censorship or suppressing these voices. The suppression is that you have to provide people with alternatives. Without alternatives, they will just come to the same thing over and over again. And that's my interpretation of my finding. That information is still to the channel. It means that you have to provide information. You have to provide people with alternative information. You cannot just censor you don't like and leave people with nothing. They will just come. So that's my take for the significance of these findings. Indicators of inequality, I haven't taken a look at it. I didn't see why I was not taking a look at it. Maybe it seems to be, and I suppose the argument would follow that because of mosques would be stronger in regions with higher inequality, because people are more upset with status quo.
It could also be that more people need a mosque because it's more unequal.
Yeah.
And that drives the conservatism. Like, isn't that like a fairly standard kind of argument among?
You mean poverty or
inequality.
I wasn't especially thinking of like a hard variable, but either.
Yeah.
I mean, poverty could drive intolerance, inequality could drive intolerance. So these sort of economic factors that drive, that I think is a common explanation for causing intolerance. I was just wondering whether or not, I mean, because you could measure those kinds of things in CODES, in IFIS as well. Lots of different sources of information about that, and that could be readily testable. Especially in relation to Sana's question.
I haven't. What I did was I examined whether the effects vary by the level of agrarianness in the kecamatan, like the proportion of people who do agrarian work. Doesn't.
Well, that could, but there's an enormous amount of inequality within agrarian society too. So there's rich farmers, poor farmers, middle class farmers.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that's important to look at more seriously.
Yeah, and it's a good, thank you. So, two questions, the most are not randomly assigned, that's, totally agree. I cannot give a technical answer to that because I agree that most are not randomly assigned, and it's possible that there are some pre-existing predisposition of the kecamatan that have moved that might affect the judgments. What I can do is just trying to rule out that explanations like empirically. First with the matching, so I match on these variables The first variables are kecamatan level variables, median age, proportion male, proportion working, median education, proportion Muslim, diversity in language, and also then individual level variables. And I also matched on the number of existing mosques in 2007. Again, to rule out and to make the treated kecamatan as similar as possible on the baseline. And what I did also, I actually play around with your data, NVMS. The new mosque, the control kecamatan is the red line, the new mosque, the treated kecamatan is the dashed line, and this is where the treatment wave was measured. I think there's not much different in terms of the average proportion of violent incidents between these two kecamatan's. So yeah, I agree that mosques are not randomly assigned, but as far as I can see, with this parallel trends checking and matching that I do try to rule that out as a feasible explanation for the effects. That's my answer for your first question. And the second question is, there's a good question about how big the kecamatan actually are, and whether it's reasonable to think of the treatment as being visibly exposed to residents in the kecamatan. So, sorry, this is kecamatan. So this is actually the population size of the kecamatan's, and this is number of analyzed kecamatan. The majority of the analyzed kecamatan's have 50,000 or fewer population. So it's pretty small kecamatan's actually. This one is in Jakarta Barat. I forgot. It's a huge. It's a small kecamatan in terms of size, but it has a huge population. So that's, I think 50,000 is not. It's not small, but it's not terribly big in order for few mosques to be failed by the residents. That would be my answers to that.
Okay, so should we take more questions? Yeah, so we have one question online, and then Nafa, and then Pak Firman. Pak Firman, yeah, okay. Silakan.
Thank you.
Alex.
We have one question from Terry Hull, who's joining us online, and he says, thank you for your presentation. Have you analyzed the IFLS data, that's the Indonesian Family Life Survey data, I think, to look at the male-female differences in the relation of new mosques and measures of intolerance?
Yeah, it doesn't matter whether sex doesn't condition the treatment effects. I was initially thinking the same, because again, my assumption at the time was that these effects must be driven by private prayer. And only men go to private prayer, so the effects would be stronger for men. It's the same, but that makes sense once we consider that the effects is actually about information that's coming out of mosque. Information is felt equally by men and women.
Okay, Nafa, and then Pak Firman.
Well, initially I had two questions, but one of them has been asked by Sana, so I'm not gonna delve deeper into that. I'm just saying that, you know, it could be the reverse causality thing and why we have new mosques. It's, you know, you're saying it's from the demand side because there's more Muslims and so on, but also because some people might not be satisfied with the existing mosque or owned by certain ormas, so that's why you have groups like HTI having their own mosque at the center of life, center of economy and everything, because they want to establish a new kind of mosque. Or it could be a matter of supply, like what Colin said, not poverty. Usually people build mosques because they want to show their wealth.
Yeah.
So it's a supply, a question of supply.
Rich people build mosques.
Like, you're so rich, you can build a mosque.
Yeah,
Yeah.
social standing, yeah.
But my main thing, comment is on the, you know, your mechanism of identity, network and group attachment. I don't know if you know, in the sociology of religion, there's also a criteria of strictness. So it's not just, you know, any kind of mosque or religious groups, but, you know, how much how much sacrifices they demand out of their members. So mosques or groups that, you know, they're very strict, they limit relationship with non-members, but also offering other kinds of social and material rewards. You know, you would expect them to have more exclusionary attitudes. So it's not, so related to your last hypothesis about information and cognition, I don't think it's just a matter of cognition. It's also because of conditioning through everyday practices in the mosque and the social pressure and everything. So, you know, critical information availability of alternative media, I don't think that's the only mechanism. So if you talk about the broader literature on identity and group attachment, there's a lot there, you know, social conditioning and all the strictness of the community mosque itself that would affect the business.
Yeah, no, I think the more strict and demanding a house of worship is, the more actually they attach their members. Just trying hard to figure out what's a good measure for that. But I forgot to mention this earlier, because I think it's also important, like who actually built new mosques, right? One piece of the findings that is not on the slides is that, so there's information about the type of mosque, whether it's Masjid Jami or government mosque, like Masjid Raya, Masjid Besar, I forgot. So Masjid Raya is on the provincial level, Masjid Besar is on the kabupaten level, I forgot. But Masjid Jami is the neighborhood ones. And so I ran couple analysis and I find that actually the new mosque is actually really driven by the Masjid Jami. So if you analyze only new mosques that are quote unquote controlled by the government, that is the Masjid Besar, Masjid Raya, or masjid that's basically government run, there's no effect of new mosques.
And usually Masjid Raya also only one in one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's
It
right.
has to be Masjid Jami.
Yeah, has to be Masjid Jami.
It has to be Masjid Jami that to have these effects. It has to be the community level,
So this is not a story of mosques, it's a story of small mosques,
community mosque.
communities.
Yeah.
That seems like an important headline article, right?
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Uh,
That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting.
Oh,
but
yeah.
It's also one of the most important. And then, as Sana said, if it's small, then it's a demand side story.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think, I know like this push toward one RT, one mosque. Like in my Kalitaris, there's like every RT has their own mosque. Which makes it even more community and we might think, and I think that's really the story of this presentation is that these community institutions have community influence. And that's something that we need to understand better, because it's not important to understand only how these institutions shape the people who come to them, because these institutions actually also shape the people around them who don't necessarily come to them. Yes.
Okay, Pak Firman?
Yeah. My question is actually very similar to Sana and also Nafas, because that's really the important question, right? You want to, because the direction of the causality, the existing condition, that really is where the story is. And the only, well, you try to answer that methodically with the parallel trend assumption, which I also don't find too convincing, but what you did there, you matched the before characteristic, but only on things that are observable in the data. And because these people are similar in the observable characteristic, and they will go in the same trajectory. But the thing that you care about, of where, about this religious competition are not observable in the previous, where you just mentioned on, so there are things that are unobservable that also drive this result, but also there are things that are really important in driving this building of new mosques that are not in the previous wave. That you have, that's I think a difficult issue to address.
Yeah. All right, let me try another extract, and let's see if you like it. If you don't, let me know. So in one of the alternative specification, I compare control kecamatans that have 0 mosques with kecamatans that have exactly 1 new mosque, right? 1 new mosque for the period of 27 to 2013. I would make a case that these control kecamatans and these kecamatans with exactly 1 new mosque would be quite similar. Because if you only have 1 new mosque in the period of 7 years, I don't think these kecamatans would be ones that have like religious competition or whatever. So comparing the control kecamatans with 0 mosque and the kecamatans with exactly 1 new mosque, I think should at least allay some concern about treatment differences. It's not experiment.
That's not easy answer, but,
That's not easy answer.
but that probably won't satisfy a lot of people.
Yeah.
But because like the big story is what Sana started to get.
No,
And that's what you have to show.
yeah. No, I think, yeah, I mean, these questions, okay. I believe that people will mention this when I submit it to the journal. But I mean, based on this competition, I think those will be my 3 answers. The first is the matching, second is the parallel trends, and the third one is using the 0 new mosque and the 1 new mosque, because that's pretty much will be like regression discontinuity in a sense. I don't know, I would be happy if there are other ideas about how to tackle this question.
But you're still treating all mosques as equal, right?
Right. What do you mean?
Like, from one mosque to another, they can be really different, and the preacher, you have some, and Muhammadiyah, but that's it. And even that's driven from their, reported affiliation in IFLS, right? Not from the CMAS database and other probably somewhere database that has list of preachers. I don't know if there exists such thing, but preacher can be really influencing what people think, right? But here, as if all the mosques are equal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Indonesia, most affiliation, it's very blurry. We can, yeah. Yeah, when you mention about NU mosque, Muhammadiyah mosque, it's really not black and white.
Muhammadiyah rasa Salafi.
Yeah, Muhammadiyah rasa Salafi, NU rasa PKS. Yeah, it's very messy. So I was like,
Muhammadiyah and U is 1. If you're Muhammadiyah and NU, you're 1, and if you're not, you're 0. Was that it?
But it doesn't matter if you use.
Doesn't matter, you separated them out. Or
Yeah. There's no information, and I think it's in the government interest, right, not to include whether this mosque is NU or Muhammadiyah, because then then when Muhammadiyah people will claim that, hey, look, the government lists it as our mosque, and then you cannot reach here, you should go.
If I'm a reviewer, I would ask you heterogeneity analysis for.
Yeah, so there's other information in the CMAS data that are interesting, but I don't find quite reliable. There's information about congregation size, but I think that I have no way to validate that. Like people can just like come out and come down. And there's information about how many officials are there on the board, and with the size of the land and the size of the mosque. But sometimes I find like just randomly checking data, like some mosques they claim to be built on a 100 meter square land, but the building size is like 5,000 meter square. How could you build 5,000 meter square building on a 100 meter square land? it will be a miracle. But yeah, that's why I'm quite limited, in what.
Another thing that may jeopardize your, oh, sorry, you're saying is, I know so many people that they don't really trust the mosque close to their house. So they are willing to quite far away.
Yeah, that's right.
Especially in Friday prayer, I want that mosque, in other part of the town, because they like, they feel attachment to that. They don't care if the mosque.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Okay, so we have questions, from Callum and then Sana and then Paed.
No,
Oh,
it's okay,
yeah.
it's okay. No, it's okay, it's come out in the most recent conversation, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I was just wondering, do you have any sense about the extent of unregistered mosques and mushallah? Because, for example, in my community, you said that you said there were something like 290 something thousand mosques and 360,000 registered mushallah, right? In where my community, there was one mosque for 15 mushallah, right? And if you multiply that by 80,000, the number of mushallah would be, so much greater. So I was sort of wondering, perhaps there's only sort of maybe unregistered mushallah or mosques might be more a hotbed of intolerance. That they don't bother to register with the government. They're not maybe hard to measure that kind of thing. And just quickly, secondly, what in general, how do you see the policy impact of what you're arguing? Do you think about that kind of significance?
But you said before.
Oh, sorry.
Got to find it with information.
Oh, I see, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
you might have something.
Registered musolas, yeah, I don't know, that's just what the CIMAS data has, but I think I would counter the possibility that essentially the unregistered mosques and musolas that drive the effects. Because my argument would be that if even the registered mosques have these effects, that is, because again, these mosques are self-registered, right? I mean, they're registered by the government, they don't self-register. If these mosques that don't feel any objection of registering themselves to the government already have these effects, then the effects actually bigger than this. Yeah.
Sana and then Paed.
So I have a proposed solution for this problem of like.
No.
So hear me out, right? So your data is compelling, right? This one mosque and the way that you're describing it, it's compelling that there's something that the mosques are, that the building of a mosque is doing something. The only question is, does it carry as much causal weight as you are claiming the building of the mosque itself? Or is there something that precedes the mosque that is driving both the mosque and also the intolerant attitudes that come after that, right? And I don't see why you can't accept that in your theory and say, we all know that intolerance is a huge problem. Competition between communities leads to intolerance. And this is the intermediary variable that is physical landmark that people are not looking at, and my data is showing that.
Well, so I was going to ask a related question, which is the effect of having a mosque equally large in those sub-districts, which are, what was it, majority Muslim in majority non-Muslim districts?
Yeah.
Can I jump in with one online question?
Yeah.
From Haryadi, who asks, do you find any difference between mosque affiliation in terms of the level of intolerance? For example, an related mosque is more or less intolerant than Muhammadiyah.
I can answer that question. I don't have a data to know whether a mosque is NU or Muhammadiyah. But so going back to add and to you, Sana. No, there's no. I cannot test this project with the Muslim majority kecamatan in non-Muslim provinces because those kecamatan didn't have multi-respondents.
Oh.
Because, and the IFRS is rather, limited at, in the distribution of respondents that they, this is the respondents. So it's heavily concentrated in Java, whereas the findings from where new mosques are built, that's from a separate project and here and NTT and South Papua. That's- Yeah, and going back to your point, so let's see if I get your point correctly. So just basically framing my paper as like, this is a physical landmark that might capture pre-existing tensions.
That is not only the symptom, that not only results from and is a culmination of a certain level of religious competition. And you can use other people's work to show that, you know, religious competition leads to building of the mosques. But once the mosques are built, they have their own effect,
Okay.
right? In furthering intolerance through the information mechanism that you are showing is visible from the data, right? That grounds it into things that we already know.
Okay.
And nobody's gonna question you then and saying, oh, you're denying all this like stuff that happened before. You just like embed your thing in the thing that everybody's saying anyway, so you don't know what the intermediary variable here is the mosque.
And, I agree.
And I think maybe embedding it or starting with a story of what we know about growing intolerance in Indonesia in general. There's a lot of survey data on that, like nationally representative survey data that tells us about trends on these very same sorts of questions. So going back to that and saying, nationally, we know there's a trend in this direction. It's a bit patchy, it goes up and down. You know, we have also this story about competition and the growth of mosques in certain parts of the country. And now I've got this new data set and all this, and this incredibly sophisticated methodology and design that shows us that, you know, in places where you get these mosques, you get an uptick. The more mosques, an uptick in intolerance. But I think embedding it in what we already know as well would help you answer Ed's original question, which is like, well, how does this further our understanding of political Islam and intolerance? Yeah, because that was sort of absent as well. There's actually been quite a lot written about rising intolerance on certain types of questions. And actually, it's a bit patchy, you know, the trends sort of up and down in certain periods, but that was sort of missing as well.
And I think also it's good to check some work on mosque from other disciplines, like Catherine Robinson just published this edited volume on mosque in Eastern Indonesia and being Muslim. It was just published in 2 years ago. So it's an edited volume. It's also there's also some parts there talking about the intolerance too. So. Okay, so we have probably one more question. If you have one pressing issue you want to raise, one question.
I don't think it makes sense to start with a story of government mosques and then tell a story about small community mosques.
Yes.
So I think that tweaking it, that was sort of a revelation when you said, oh, these are actually just the small community mosques that are having these effects. So I think framing it in the way that Sana has described and adding making this a story about trying to really understand the mechanism behind rising intolerance in certain neighborhoods like certain kecamatan. You start with that, not the like, hey, a really kind of partisan, polarized government went in and did a study of government mosques and found, you know what I mean? I think it's sort of that number, yeah.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Okay.